Two, one, blast off. Here we go. Session two. Session one went really smoothly, really well, and I'm pleased about that. Just noticed I didn't change my paint water, so this is a really authentic kind of flow into the next session because, yeah, that's kind of how I roll here. I usually procrastinate on changing the paint water way too long. We're going to continue what we did, the paintings we started in our first session, and we're going to start with a warm-up, and then we're going to talk a bit about value in this round. I have a lot of ground I want to cover. I did a little bit of painting for myself during the break to kind of keep my juices flowing and get those ideas really churning. One reason I love painting in a series is because when I stick with a theme, it really, it just brings ideas to the surface. I start to see possibilities beyond just trying to get what I see down on paper. And so over the last week or two, as I've thought about this course and planned for it and looked at reference photos, I've spent some time painting kind of winter themed stuff. In fact, one of my very favorite paintings from this season, I'm going to try to stick it down on the work surface here and then show it to you. And we got to turn off our reference photos while we're... There we go. Okay, so is this guy right here. This little painting is a winter-inspired scene, but it didn't start out that way. All that this was when it became a painting, when it started out, was just a random brush mark. I think this guy right here kind of kicked it off. And then from there, I drew out shapes using my favorite brush strokes and colors, and I started to see a winter landscape. And then as I painted, it felt more and more exciting to create. You can see this painting on the cover of our course materials. And as I was painting, I had this idea. There was some spatter up here that looked like it could be birds. So I actually placed a couple of birds up there. And then I saw this shape is still too dominant. It's always the first thing you see. And it kind of looks like a really fat, like antelope or something. Very pregnant antelope. But over here, I don't know if that's what sparked the idea, but over here I painted two tiny deer just in the corner. And I'm not really a fan of deer these days because I just about hit one with my car the other night. It just whizzed in front of the car. But they sure add that spark of life to this landscape. And it was just kind of a random brushstroke that started that off. And when those ideas start to occur in my painting, especially when I'm painting to a theme, it's more likely to happen that I get some ideas that lead to this kind of fearless play. And so I really try to roll with that. And so we're going to see if we can't make some fearless play happen here. I want to show you what we're going to be working on. Let's just switch over to some of our reference photos. You can view them in the course content at learn.angelafair.com. I'm switching my windows. There we go. There's a whole list of reference photos. I've linked them all up for you there where you can download them. If you are in watercolor mastery, there's a very few people who do not have the straight up access in learn.angelafair.com. And if that's the case, or if you're having trouble logging in or anything like that, you can use the Dropbox link, which Robin has posted in our chat. And so there's a bunch of photos in there. You can see them here. And so we're going to be, I think my goal is to develop a quick version of this reference photo that was provided to us by Jan. Jan lives down, I believe on Vancouver Island, Jan, is that right? And so anyhow, I love this dusting of snow on the landscape. It's a challenging subject to paint, and so we're going to try and tackle that and see what we can accomplish. But before we do that, we're going to start with a warm-up, and I think I want to continue on that kind of fearless play with color that was sparked by this kind of blurry windshield photo of a sunrise on a travel excursion. And again, a poor quality photo is a great opportunity to paint your own version, to have that freedom to not feel like you have to depict every little blur in the photo. Instead, you get to do your own thing. And that's always going to lead to some heart-led exploration. So let's just switch over to the work surface here. And throw a piece of paper on the board. There we go. And this time, you know, that first idea that we had was that sunset, but this time I just want to go again with sunset, but be even more fearless and abstract in my portrayal. So I'm amping up my color with one big brush stroke. And you notice I'm using the side of my brush. Working with the side of my brush, it gives me a really nice broad stroke, and it gives me an organic shape. So I'm often starting out with the side of the brush. Again, I don't want to immerse my brush in the water because I don't like the water coming up over the ferrule. So I'm just pressing it against the side and stroking it there to get it nice and clean. We're going to add a splash of color to that. We haven't touched the cobalt teal yet, so let's do that. I like using cobalt teal with opera pink because it creates this beautiful kind of grayish color. Look at how pretty that is. And let's go even bolder. I can like this one strong diagonal stroke. Doesn't really line up with what we kind of might have expected to place in our landscape. But again, this is a warm-up. This is that idea of where we play with fearless color, using a reference photo perhaps as a jumping off point, but we want to jump pretty far if the inspiration strikes. So that's what we're going for here. Mixing up a little bit of lavender. I'm really running low. I have an order. It's probably sitting in my mailbox right now. I'll have to go check that out after we wrap up our broadcast. In the meantime, I'm using what I've got. This should get us through the day. One thing that I really love seeing, and it's interesting when it happens, is every now and then you'll see the paint will soak in, and then it also kind of illuminates up through the color that goes over top. I don't know what causes that. I'm still kind of observing and trying to figure that out, but I really love the look that it creates when you have a color that's kind of stained into the paper and also glowing through an overlaying wash. It's beautiful. I think I need a darker color because all of these colors kind of have the same kind of value strength. I think if I go to phthalo turquoise, we're going to get a really nice, bold, dark. Yeah, clearly it's bold. And I think though I want it a little bit murkier than that because if we have too many bright colors going on, it's just kind of feels like an explosion of neon. And personally, I had enough of that in the 80s. So we can touch in some of that opera pink. And I'm tilting my board so that the color starts to flow down the page. I guess that does, it is vertically. I started to say vertically and then I thought maybe that was the wrong way to describe it. Let's get some of that flow going. A little trail of water straight across the page. There's a bead of pure pigment here. Look at how that's just glowing. And that's something I should mention is that the colors in my palette today, if you've been painting for a while and you've filled up your palette with color, it might be a little harder to work up this strong saturation of pigment that I am working with today. Spend a little time before you start painting with the spray bottle, mist all your colors. And then as that water sits on the palette, it will soak in a bit and soften up those colors and give you some better saturation. But you might also need to spend some time with your brush just kind of stroking that color, nursing it into vibrant saturation. I like to have a good deal of juicy pigment on my brush, and the key is not just water, but juicy pigment. And now I'm dropping my brush. Let's add a little bit of lavender in here maybe. Lavender has a little bit of white in it, so it can sit on top of a darker color. I really just want to see that pink continue to glow. And I want to contrast it with what's underneath. And I like that little freckle of cobalt teal so much. Let's try to insert some more really pure dots of pigment. You know, when you have more pigment on your brush and less water, there's going to be less flow. It's a little bit stickier of a consistency of paint. And so it'll stay in place pretty well. I still feel like I need to put something dark and strong in there. And well, one thing we could do is take that phthalo turquoise in the sushi plate, mixing it up, and we'll add some of that carmine. And I have to stroke this one a little bit. It's a little bit drier than what's in this palette. And I'm going to get like kind of a near black, dark violet with those two colors mixed together. So let's see what that does. A light touch to start with. I don't want to commit too strongly until I know if I'm going to like it. At the same time, there's nothing like a bold stroke to really give you that sense of fearless risk. Let's go big here now. Basically, we're adding something that could be trees. And you know, if you're warming up like this and you end up with a piece of paper that's absolutely covered in marks that don't really have a discernible direction, that is okay. The purpose of a warm up like this is just to kind of get those creative juices flowing, and it's not about the outcome. These are small pieces of paper. I would say that everything we're painting in this course could be described as a development piece. When we work small sketches like this, you know, you've got this time commitment that's very, very brief. More phthalo turquoise. And that should make these paintings basically not too precious. They're inexpensive opportunities to explore, you know, something that could translate into a really beautiful, powerful, larger painting down the road. We make those risks so that we can teach ourselves how to paint and how to paint like us. So I'm overworking this almost deliberately. Look at how powerful that dark is up on top to give us that, to make the pink brighter. Look at how bright this looks now because of so many darks on the page. So that's a great thing to see and explore. Contrast between dark and light is really what gives our paintings the most impact. I'm going to grab a drink of water, and then we're going to switch over and start to work on finishing up our trees that we started in the first session. Okay. Oh, I needed that water. Let's just compare the two here. We've got this guy that we started previously, and I actually wanted to go into this one. I know there are artists who do all their paintings in one session and they would never go back and finish, but I think one or two crisp lines at the end after the painting has dried can really add that finishing touch. In this case, if I add a crispness to the horizon, it's going to give my landscape an even stronger feel of being in the landscape. And one thing I've learned as well with painting a landscape with a lot of distance like this is some of these really gradual diagonals. So not a sharp 45-degree, but a really shallow kind of diagonal line will help with that sense of scope and give that feeling of distant. Well, in our community, it's fields that are bordered by trees, and so those diagonal lines actually indicate where those fields might end and meet up with another piece of property. So we'll set those aside, and let's take a look at the dried trees here, and I'm going to pop my reference photo up on the screen. Remember that we were looking at it in black and white so that we could better see the values. And then we have this challenge of wanting to paint our darkest darks here and then needing to look for ways to add further depth to this version. And this one's a little further along than this one. I had to wait for things to dry in order to build up those next depths. And there's actually two different methods of painting this here. Even if I were to paint this without Yeah, without masking fluid. I'm building up from light to dark here, whereas from here, for this one, I went with the light values first, the whites, and then I went almost straight to the darkest darks, and then painting the in-between values. And that means I have to leave space for those in-between values, whereas here I had my whites first, then the secondary light value, the second lightest values, and those covered the entire shape of the tree so that the darkest darks and maybe those middle darks, next darkest darks, can go on over top of that second lightest value. Does that make sense? So there are two different ways of thinking there. And I really feel like when I'm teaching a watercolor workshop, pretty much every time someone asks me, how do you paint this? And they're showing me a reference photo or a subject, my answer is always, it depends. There is never just one way to paint anything. And so we have to figure out what works best for the style we want to paint and the subject that we're painting. You know, what's going to be the easiest and to wrap our brains around and create the effect we want to create. So let's try this guy first because he's going to need to dry completely before we take the masking fluid off. My goal right now is to get those darkest darks in place. And then I think I probably will take the masking fluid off because I don't, again, these are short painting sessions. So I'm not a person who wants to put 4 or 5 layers of paint onto my painting. So we're looking again for the very darkest darks, and they are almost entirely, they're very connected to the masking fluid. The darks, are emerging out from under the snow, and so wherever I have masking fluid, I can place those dark values underneath. And I'm using the colors I mixed previously here. Actually, I just added a little bit of zoisite and a little more phthalo turquoise to this puddle that I had. And it's already got some violet in it, and violet with green makes a really nice shadow color, so it's all good. There's going to be some really nice contrasts that happen when we take this masking fluid off and see the whites really come and pop in contrast with the dark values that are here. And I'm going to flow out, if I can, some of these darks right into the shadow areas here. That's going to give me a really nice seamless look where you can't tell almost where the tree ends and the shadow begins, which is often what happens when we're in the shadows. Things get connected by that shadow shape, different objects. So we'll see how that looks when we take the masking fluid off. Pebeo masking fluid, that's the brand that I use. It's quite forgiving. I actually have applied it when my paper wasn't as dry as it could have been, and it didn't permanently stick to the paper, which has happened to me with Winsor & Newton. You can actually, and I've done it successfully once, I've not done it enough to say for sure that it's the best method, but you can actually mix your Pebeo with a little bit of water and create a mask that kind of leaks a little bit, because one of the drawbacks of masking fluid is that when we take this off, it's going to feel like some of the edges are very crisp. We're really going to see the different, like the line between dark and light is going to be very strongly delineated. Look at how that tree shape is starting to come to life as we paint those darks. Suddenly this version is starting to catch up to this version. And when we analyze them at the end, I'm going to be tempted to choose as my favorite whichever one was more successful in creating a great tree shape. But overall, I want to look at the technique and see which technique was more successful. If I'm painting a half-hour Christmas tree painting, I can do a lot of versions until I get to a tree that I really love. And every time I'm going to grow a little bit more confident and bolder in how I paint it. So we're going to let that one dry. We're going to go back to this one, and we're going to go into the tidying up stage here. And I think this is a stage, if you're a new painter, I would really encourage you to take some time and do this whole tidying up procedure on your paintings, because I know when I was a newer painter and I was painting in a bit more of a realistic style, working this step made my paintings really sing and come to life. So I'm going to actually move to a smaller brush. And this one's not in the course catalog. It's a Princeton Long Round number 4, so it's just a bit smaller than the brushes I've been using. So I'm going to have a little bit more control. Anytime you're painting with a tiny brush like this, means you're in a place where it's very easy to get fussy about detail. So this could be a chance to really obsess over detail. We don't really want to do that, but we just want to tidy up some of our shapes. So I can go in around where I know I want to have a nice blanket of snow, and I can just neaten up that shape a little bit. Maybe because the snow often has a bit of a cap to it, and so maybe there's a slightly darker shadow immediately under that. So right here I've gone in and added kind of a secondary darker shadow. So you've got your darkest dark that we had, but I've actually gone a little bit of a step darker, and that's going to make the snow there pop out just a little bit more. I can do that. I'm going to try not to do it to obsession, but I'm going to try to go in a little bit darker in here. And I can also add maybe some little pine needle shapes that are going to make my tree look a little furrier or pokier. I don't know what the word is. So just some little fine lines, maybe around the edges. This shape right here bothers me a little bit. It seems incomplete, I think, because I need this snow to be a little bit more contoured, but I also can go in and add a few more branches there, and that'll help reinforce that shape. When I was painting a lot of florals, this tidying up stage would have meant going along the edges of the flower petals and smoothing out any roughness in my brush strokes on the contours of the flowers. Adding a little hint of darkest dark right in here is going to give us the feeling that we can look deep inside the tree. Maybe there's a squirrel hiding in there that no one can see. There would be if it was in our yard, and my dog would be barking. Look at how the eye goes right to that center of the tree now as it becomes the darkest thing in the painting. So we follow that shape. Speaking of barking dogs. We follow that shape, we continue that dark patch. We have another one up here to kind of echo and carry the eye up the tree. But I've made the shape a little bit smaller. And this is the stage that you can take as far as you want to go. You know, I could continue adding needles and creating depth in my shadows. It's another thing I could do. Maybe I want to take the pale blue and, you know, create some shadow shapes that are just a little darker than the ones that are already on the page. And that's going to add more depth to my tree as well. And these, if I'm going with a third value shadow shape, maybe that secondary shadow, like we said, was a 2 or a 3 if you had a value scale. Maybe this one's a 4. And it needs to be connected or flowing into that 2 or 3 value so that we have, so that it doesn't look too stark. This one actually looks quite stark to me, so then I might use a damp brush and soften it. Soften and then maybe lift some of the excess moisture, and then it has this nice smooth transition. Over here, I might decide I want a little bit of a hint of shadow. And so we just keep building up our values, being mindful that the more time we spend on this, the more likely we are to actually lose our whites. We don't want to get so busy adding shadows that we lose sight of the fact that we need to have whites in order to create that contrast. The other thing I wanted to do before we called this complete was put some of those distant dark trees in. I'm just going to use the side of my brush and a little bit of the violet that I mixed up to create a nice contrasting distant shape that could be trees. And it's going to go right up to this snowy branch so that we have the contrast between dark and light. And then on the opposite side of the page, that actually dark shape looks a little bit more broken in our reference photo. So we're going to extend it out from the tree, but then we're also going to kind of taper it so that it's not just completely boring, like the same solid shape from left to right, right to left. And I'm going to add a little blob of water just to add some, to keep it from looking too flat. And then I can lift a little bit, because we tend to go with our darkest darks and then end up with this very flat black, which we don't need black. We want we can have some depth in our darks, and you can see the depth in our darks here as we see the layers of dark that happen here and the drip of water that was creating some depths there. You can actually see a bit of the sky peeking through, which is kind of an error, but it's not one that I'm going to let bother me for a Christmas card size painting. Another thing that I think I'm going to do before I call this complete is just go in and tweak my shadows just one last time. And I think I need a little more verdite or blue for that. And I'm going to actually place them under the tree. I'm glancing at my tree reference photo and coming in around the tree needles. Now the problem here is that my dark needles and my dark shadows are similar in value, and so there's not going to be contrast there. And so I need to also create shadow under the snow and create little gaps where the white snow is visible in order for this to kind of read like shadow. But when we have a tree or an element like that, it's really nice to put some shadow underneath it because it anchors it to the landscape. And it shows it doesn't feel so cut and pasted. So we go in, I'm going to actually lighten my shadows here. Yeah, I think that works. Maybe create another shadow shape here. And I should have sized my brush up again. I don't really need a brush this small for this section. And this just falls in the category of tightening, finishing up those details, tightening up a little bit, tidying up, as I called it earlier. The idea here is making some of the darks darker so that the brights look a little bit brighter. You can't make your brights brighter by adding anything to them, but you can darken the areas around them so they pop forward a bit more. So that's kind of what we want to do. I'm not gonna obsess about it. It would be very easy to get a magnifying glass out at this point and want to put some more contoured shadows in there. It might, be something. Whoops! I don't know where that color came from on my brush. Trying to soften an edge and added some turquoise. I'll just flow it off the page. It would be very easy to want to improve the snow contours, and just you start to get a little bit obsessed. The longer you stare at a painting, the harder it is to see it as a whole, and we start looking at all those individual elements. We're going to quickly take a look at this guy, and we're at 12:30. We don't have nearly the time that I'd like to have, but we're going to, I'm trying to think here. I want to remove my masking fluid, and I probably could wait, but no, let's remove it now. And that means I do have to run across my studio because I forgot to grab my masking fluid removing tool. It'll take me about 10 seconds. So my masking fluid removing tool is just this piece of kind of crepe rubber, and all you need to do is just lightly rub it on your painting. Make sure your painting is completely dry or you're going to be smudging paint. And it just pulls the masking fluid off. Please be sure, if you're using masking fluid, if you're going to invest all the time into putting masking fluid on your painting, please plan to use good paper. You do not want to have masking fluid that tears your paper as you remove it. Also, please don't leave your masking fluid on your painting for weeks or months at a time. Don't have your masked painting in direct sunlight. Don't heat it with a blow dryer. That doesn't always result in disaster, I'm told. But it sure can, so you just want to be real careful that if you're going to put that time and effort into putting that masking fluid on, you want to have a good outcome. So here we go. Now I've removed the masking fluid, and look at how crisp and stark those whites are. They almost look pasted on, and so we need to spend some time smoothing that out. Again, this is the tidying up stage. So I'm going to go back to that skinny brush. We might as well. And my kind of mixture of turquoise and carmine and a little bit of zoisite. And you know, when you're using a palette with 18 different colors, you have some unity there, which is really nice because the colors in my palette over here that I've mixed will look unified as long as I'm not introducing other completely random colors. So I try to be consistent. So I'm tidying up some of the shapes of the snow right now with some additional darkest darks. Putting anywhere where I have some roughness, I might smooth out the snow a little bit in a few places, but it can be a little bit rough in others. It doesn't have to be all smooth and flawless. You know, I don't know if you've thought of this before, but it's something I have to remind myself. I can do whatever I want. There is no law that says your painting has to be realistic. I could be painting an orange tree with purple snow. You know, I get to do whatever pleases me. And if I'm painting to show what I feel as being more important than what I actually see, you know, it's the response that the scene arouses in me. So I see a beautiful scene, I move to paint it. But maybe I paint it in vivid colors because my memory exaggerates. That's my prerogative, and it makes my painting more authentically me. With enough time and skill, you can paint photorealism of any subject you want, and there's a lot of tools out there to help you learn how to be a photorealistic painter. But there is only one person who can paint just like you. And from your own interesting and diverse imagination. And when I see artists painting stuff, you know, I've been teaching this long enough that a number of you, I know, I've seen your paintings and I recognize them when I see them posted online or in our Fearless Artists community. And I know they're from you. And that to me is more exciting than were you to paint a flawless version just like this one that I'm teaching right now. You know, if you took this and added your own colors and your own shapes and made it completely your own, that's always the most exciting thing for me to see. We all should be free to be our own individuals as artists. Now look at how that little bit of tweaking that I'm doing, adding detail around the snow, the masked snow shapes, adding some of those darkest darks to give us that depth, like we're looking deeply into the scene. That just helps, already makes the masking fluid feel more cohesive in the painting. Here there's a big white shape. I'm going to make it into several smaller white shapes by just adding a few pine needles there. I can add a few pine needles over here and do the same thing. Just like there's a little bit of branches peeking out from the snow. And that gives us a sense of depth. And we're going to add that secondary lightest value as well. But I'm liking that. And notice that this version is able to be whiter. I will confess that. I don't love masking fluid, but you can see there's a lot more white in this version over this version. We got to take the masking tape off so we can see them together side by side that way. Masking tape never looks pretty. But if I'm going in now, I'm going to ruin everything by adding some pale blues. But these pale blues will give our shadows a bit more, or give our snow a bit more shadow. I'm going to blot a little bit to soften, keep it really subtle. One thing I do it's a love-hate relationship that I have with watercolor, because no one will ever see the subtlety of your painting on social media. There are cameras making reproductions and prints of your paintings. You just can't capture the beautiful, soft transitions of color, the ethereal veils of color that your painting will hold when you're working with those delicate colors. But it does mean that if you sell a painting based on someone seeing a photograph of it, they are going to be so happy when they see the original and realize that it has even more delicate beauty than your reference or than your photograph showed. And that is one of the reasons I actually really enjoy selling work online. And I have every confidence when I send a painting off that if they loved it on the internet, they're going to really love it in person. I'm just contouring around this mound of snow here, putting in that distant mass of trees. I'm going to leave it at that. I think I need a little bit of a shadow under here. I can hear you agreeing with me. And I'm just about ready to take some questions before we do a very quick and fun painting of that fence that I showed you earlier from Jan. Would you believe that we're going to do that painting in about 10 minutes? I'm just debating maybe a little hint of shadow over here. Yeah, look at how that popped that edge of the tree right forward like that. Cool. Good stuff. And now I have two paintings for Christmas cards. I am going to peel the tape off. It's going to make a noise. My mother really doesn't like to look at my paintings unless they are off the board with no tape around them. She says she just can't analyze them or appreciate them until she sees them, well, almost in a frame. She's just that kind of person. So here we have two versions, and I wanted you to see them both side by side so that you can contrast the two. I feel like definitely this one, you see more of the impact of the white snow. This one, the tree feels a little bit fuller, just the shape that I created there. I really like the pattern of depths and the little bit more looseness that's happening here, but I will continue to challenge myself to leave more whites. And every time I do this type of painting, if I were to paint this tree again, it would be easier for me to be more confident in leaving whites. Every time I paint a scene, I get a little bit better at interpreting it. Okay, I'm going to take a few questions, and then we're going to do that really fast fence scene. Time is a whizzing by. There we go. Oh, and my face isn't even really red from all that feverish painting. So taking a look at the questions. Christy says, so when you put the second values in the tree with no masking, did you go in with the darkest values while the gray was wet? There was a little bit of moisture still happening there. You definitely can see that in the finished painting, how there's a lot more softness in this one. When you're working with masking fluid, you just end up with a crisper result. Here I definitely have that softer, more flowing effect. And so that's something to keep in mind. You know, a lot of times we choose a technique based on the result we want to have. So that's something to keep in mind. Diane says, if you wanted to add snow in a spot, could you use gouache? Yes, I have seen... let's talk about that for a minute, because I have reasons why I would avoid using gouache in a winter scene like this. I don't mind. I'm not opposed to using opaque colors like gouache, like white gouache in a painting. But if we're using gouache to fix a spot because we lost our whites and we're expecting to get the same white that is everywhere else on the page, it's not going to work. It's going to stand out as different. White gouache is not the same as the white of the paper. And so you end up with this very strong contrasting element in your painting. If I were to use gouache in the scene, I would want to be using it everywhere as an element, not as a repair solution, if that makes sense. Because with watercolor on white paper, your white is the white of the paper, and then everything gets layered over top. The white is always showing through your transparent watercolor. And so as soon as we put gouache on, it's like sticking a piece of tape on. It's going to stand out unless we're using it as a specific design element. I think that makes sense. I'm sure I'd have articulated it better if I had more time to think about that, how to phrase it. Just taking a look, any more questions before we switch the page? I do think gouache is really fun to use as, it can be fun to use as spatter, and it can be fun to use to add a little glow into the scene. I do not have a painting nearby where I've used it though, so I can't show you. Okay, let's switch over back to the work surface, and we're going to pop up a new reference picture. Boom, and we're going to put the other one away. There we go. Okay, so this snowy fence is a really good example of, actually we should look at the big one. It's a really good example of the kind of scene that we often choose to paint in watercolor. It's got several elements. You know, if you're picking a landscape, you're probably going to pick something similar to this, where you've got trees, you've got a road, you've got a fence, you've got multiple things going on. And that can make it feel like we're painting, have a lot of things to paint. And so our goal in the next few minutes is to do this version as a 10-minute painting. And we could call this a value study. And I was going to do value studies yet today if we have time. Otherwise, we'll move it to tomorrow. Another small 5x7 piece. When you're on a small piece of paper, you really do not need to spend hours painting. And I'm getting a beam of sunlight that's kind of a distraction. I'm going to just fix my blind. Oh, wrong one. These short December days, it's really hard to close the blinds when the sun comes in, but it will make it easier to see the workspace. Okay, so we really don't want to feel like we need to paint everything in the scene as our first objective. So the first thing I do when I look at a reference photo like this is ask myself, what is the most important thing in this scene that I want to paint? And I'm going to paint that and make that my priority. For one reason, because I have a constraint of time. For another reason, because I forgot the other reason. I have a constraint of time. I want to paint, well, I have a small workspace too. I don't want to be fussy with details. And thirdly, my goal of painting as a loose painter gets very complicated when I also feel like I need to paint a lot of different elements. You know, it's just pretty hard to be loose when you have, you know, 4 or 5 different things that you have to get proportioned and flowing in your scene. So my priority is going to be the fence, and as such I'm going to start with the fence and build out. That is the technique that works for a scene like this. You start with the first thing you want people to look at, everything else comes out from that and is simplified. So we have to keep that in mind when we start painting the fence. I'm going to use the Hematite Burnt Scarlet here. You could choose a brown like burnt sienna would be nice. Or you could even mix a blue and an orange would make a nice mixture for the brown. We have a fence with snow on it, and because of that, I have just trying to get the reference photo on my screen so I can see it better. We have a fence with snow on it, but if I paint the fence, I can actually paint around the snow. Notice too that there's a road in this scene, and that is the last time I'm going to mention the road because I'm not going to paint it. And I'm also going to cheat a little bit. We've got a row of fence posts, and they give us a sense of scale. Just debating how close together they should be. We get to be a little bit free and loose. This is a 10-minute sketch. I'm going to cheat a little bit because the cross beams actually go in front of the posts, but in my version I'm going to paint them in behind so that I can paint the verticals first. Because there's snow on top of my fence, I can put that crossbar as a skinny little line and know that above it is snow. Same thing here. This one's going to be a little bit broader. This line is really wide, and I kind of like it, so I'm going to leave it. It's more important for me that my lines look painterly than that they look perfect and proportioned. And so we have, it's a fence. I think we can all tell it's a fence, and so we're going to let that fence just sit for a moment. And something I did, I was fooling around with this on my during lunch, and so I added a little bit of lavender into my fence, and I really like that look. So we're going to add a hint of lavender into that damp hematite, because the hematite is a bit of a rusty color, and it separates beautifully, which is why I wanted to use it. I don't know, it just looks really nice with the lavender. And then we're going to paint some lavender to give us kind of a frosty look. And let's pull it right down along the fence line to kind of suggest our grasses. It gives us a really pale kind of gray. So I'm painting outward from my fence, and I'm using the side of my brush. I'm leaving a white space for my snow on top of each crossbar. You can't see it, but it's happening in my head. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to paint that background of the dark trees. And I've been enjoying using a combination of Moonglow and Zoisite for this. And the side of my brush. And we're going to just scrub in. I think that's the right word. It's basically what we're doing. Right up to the fence. I'm going to leave a little white gap here and there, and that will indicate my snow. Got to be a little bit, the problem with focal point painting is you do have to be a little bit careful to paint around your focal point. There's a cap of snow on that fence post, so I'm going to leave a gap for the cap, and I'm going to leave a line of white on that crossbar, that invisible snow that I've been mindful of through this part of the painting. I'm going to go in with the Zoisite on its own and just pull up to create some trees. Swish. And again, I come to another fence post, I leave a little white gap. And we can exaggerate it if we want. We can add tons of snow. I don't think Jan will mind. It's called artistic license because it literally means you have permission to do whatever you want with your reference photo. It is very uncommon in art galleries for artists to put beside their painting a picture of the reference photo so that you can compare. I'm sure there are galleries where people will do that so they can show you how photorealistic they are, but that is not our goal. Look how pretty the moon glow and the zoisite are together. This is a little bit interesting perspective. We have varying widths between our fence posts, which basically means that the fence post is going to feel like it's going in and out rather than being in a straight line. I like that. It shows us farmers have artistic sensibilities or just can't be bothered to, really measure out a straight line. Or maybe it just means that, the land has shifted a little over the years and the fence is getting tumbled down, and that's good too. Again with the gap around the crossbar. And now in my reference photo, there's a lot of grass and white snow back here, so I should actually be, my line of trees has been kind of creeping down at an angle, and that's wrong. That gives us an inaccurate perspective. At the same time, it's probably not a big deal. But I wanted to put leave a little bit of white space. The best way to create a snowy look in watercolor is to leave some whites. And I also wanted to put in a hint of yellow, just a tiny hint of Mars yellow, to hint at that grass down here. And then when I get up close to this fence crossbar, I can make that little mound of snow again. And maybe a little hint here of that warm yellow color to give us that pile of snow. So we're just getting a feel for it right now. I have no idea if we're within our 10-minute limit, and I'm not worried about it. We have a few more minutes left in this lesson, and we'll be back tomorrow for 2 more sessions. And if I absolutely cannot get everything done in time, because I have so many different things I'd love to share, and we'll do the most important ones. But if there's more stuff, then we'll just go a little longer or something tomorrow. We'll fit it all in. All the important stuff has to happen. So let's put some grass in the foreground. Again, because we want this to feel like a snowy scene, we have to leave white space. I'm not masking here. I need to give that feeling of snow with the power of suggestion. And that's going to be how we make it work. Using a little bit of pure hematite to add some texture to the boards. The area of your painting that you spend the most time on is the part of the painting that is going to be your focal point. It does not matter if you chose something else to be your focal point. If you spend more time working in another area, that labor is going to be evident on your page, and it's going to bring the eye right to that part of the painting and anchor them there. So keep that in mind when you see something that feels like a mistake in your painting. If you're investing a lot of time trying to fix it, it's probably going to stand out in your painting as a distraction from the focal point. You're almost better off just letting that mistake kind of exist on the page and put more time into strengthening your focal point so that the eye doesn't rest on that mistake area. Cause a distraction somewhere else. Excuse me. Okay, I'm not putting the road in. I tried doing a version with the road in a previous study, and it did not feel right. It was too distracting in the scene. The line I used to paint that road was too crisp, and it just kind of felt too dominant and out of place, so we don't do it. But I do like having the darkest darks in the background to contrast with those little snow caps on the fence posts. So let's work that a little bit, again, back and forth with our Zoisite and Moonglow. Some of these granulating colors, Zoisite is a Primatech color from Daniel Smith, and it does seem like it's a lot of those Primatechs, they will kind of lighten as they dry a bit more than I usually expect them to. And so I do often go over those Primatech colors with a little bit more of the same color, just to add some intensity. This also, I'm not filling it in like a solid mass. Rather, you know, there's still some of that lighter value color in behind peeking through. So we get kind of a little more depth by spending this little bit of extra time darkening the near trees. The far ones, you also see a hint of trees in the background that seem farther away. Just carefully working around those fence posts. Again, don't want to cover up those snow caps. I can actually fade away there. Notice how this is the darkest, so your eye just goes right there. Very good. I like that. So one more way to make the eye come into the painting is let's do that secondary blue shadow to make our snow have some contour. I'm going to use my pale blue that was previously mixed and just do a little bit of shadow along the bottom edge of where the snow would be. And I don't even need to soften it and bring it up and fade it into the white, although I could. But even just a hint of that blue, especially in these nearest fence posts. The distant ones, the shadow is going to be a little narrower because it's further away, the shape is smaller. And then the other thing I found that really was nice with these fence posts is to add a little darkest dark in there too. So we can go around the bottom of the fence post with some darks. I'm using a little bit of Moonglow and Hematite on my brush because they're already existing on the painting. And we'll just give our fences just a bit of a weathered look. There's kind of a strand of wire there, so I'll hint at that. And you know, the power of suggestion does more in watercolor than strict detail. It really, we're drawn to finish the sentence, so leaving, you know, things loose really gives our painting kind of a more interesting engagement with the viewer. So dark on this side of the fence post, you know, not all over the whole thing, just kind of underneath and along one edge, maybe a line or two of weathered wood. And in the distance, you want to keep it really simple. I missed the white shadow under this snow on this guy, so let's do that quickly. Well, we're running out of time. And yeah, I'm going to call that done. Now this is very simplified. If I were doing this on a larger piece of paper, there would be a need for more time spent on the shapes and the details. When you're working in a 5x7, it's pretty forgiving. You can get away with quite a lot. It might be fun to just take a minute and use a fine brush to throw up a little bit more grass here. I don't want to paint a dark line, so I'm barely touching the paper with the brush. I don't want the line to be thick. Take over the painting. And maybe I should have chosen the Mars Yellow as my color rather than the Zoisite. Do a little bit of yellow as well. Again, we don't want to lose all our whites because then we lose that feeling of snow. The palette we've chosen, the colors that I'm using in this painting really give to that wintry feel, don't you think? They're a little bit bleak. And yet there's a lot of warm colors here. There's brown, there's yellow. The green is often considered a warm color as well. The lavender and the moon glow are the coolest. And but something about the muted tones really give you that kind of subdued feeling. And I think that works really well for a wintry scene. I'm going to switch over. I think we have a few questions probably again. I like seeing it on the screen actually rather than up in person. When I look at my painting through a camera viewfinder, it's amazing how you really see the contrasts and whether or not they're working. And it really shows you weak areas in the painting as well. This painting has this great feeling of distance. The darks being in the back and then the lights down in the lower half. It just has this really nice sense of balance as well. And I said lower half, but really the grasses and the horizon take up about 2/3 of the page. It's not an even half and half. And I like, notice how, truthfully, I was a little worried about the width of that second fence post. It was a little wider than I'd planned for it to be, and it totally still works. That's why I'm so glad I didn't obsess about trying to fix the width of that fence post. I just kept working and I adapted, and it mattered way less than I thought. So really keep in mind that if you're tackling a new subject and you want to grow in confidence and really depict something that has some looseness and self-expression to it, spend time playing with it in those smaller versions. Try abstract versions, try value studies. We're going to do that tomorrow. Really think about giving yourself opportunity to try the scene in a lot of different ways and simplify, simplify, simplify. We were here to paint one thing, that fence. Everything else needed to support the fence. The trees, and we'll go back and look at it again. Those distant trees, beautiful pine trees in our reference photo. And I could have invested so much time in getting those shapes right and trying to show the snow sitting on the branches. And because we didn't look at that, there's some dry brush there that actually gives us that feeling of snow on a few branches, but we focused on just framing those fence posts and keeping our white snow caps. And that was the most important part of this scene. One thing that I have to tell you, I confess, is that this is not the first time I've painted this. I painted this version last week, and it's a half sheet of watercolor paper. So this was not the first time I'd done it. And you can see in this version a little less attention to focusing on the fence post or the fences being the focal point. I was working on getting some nice tree shapes in. I put in the road, and those things ended up feeling like a distraction, especially the road. It just really didn't strengthen my painting. So I realized as I was working this that I needed to keep the main thing, keep it all about the fence. Everything else needed to be simplified so that I could paint that loosely. I'm a loose painter, but that does not mean that I can paint complicated subjects loosely. It means I need to focus on focal point and build out from that. So I'm seeing from your comments that you're excited by this study, and that's great. I want to encourage you to take some time to paint it. If you can make time today, you can rewatch this video. Remember that the entire course will all be hosted at learn.angelafair.com once all the lessons are done. Right now, it's just the first 2 lessons up there, the ones we did today. And then tomorrow we'll be back, same times, 10 a.m. and noon Mountain Standard Time. It's -7 UTC, and whatever it is in your time zone, I will leave it to you to figure it out. because I don't want to get it wrong and have you show up at the wrong time. You will also receive an email about 20 minutes before the broadcast with the link and the reminder to join. And if you're in the Fearless Artist community, we don't want you to miss these lessons. We are putting notifications everywhere. I want to thank Robin for being here to moderate. Robin's done such an amazing job of just being on top of those colors and reiterating them as I mention them. And, collecting your questions as well so I don't miss anything. We're going to be back tomorrow. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you tomorrow.